Hello, everyone. Thanks for listening to this panel. This is a comics panel for Inconceivable 2020, an online indie convention, and the title is called Kickstarter, Grants and Webtoons, Alternatives to the Traditional Publishing Model. So I'm your moderator, and my name's Queenie Chan. I'm a manga-style comic book artist whose first published work was The Dreaming with US-based publisher Tokyo Pop, and I also worked as an illustrator for best-selling authors Dean Koontz and Carly Chan. I'm currently working on a series of biographical comics on historical queens called Women Who Were Kings. And next year I'll be doing a PhD on mixing comics and video games. So I've got several guests with me today to talk about this topic. Many thanks to them for participating. So I'm going to ask them to introduce themselves. So Stefan, we'll start with you.
Oh, look, thanks for having me on first. I really appreciate to be part of the panel. My name is Stephen Cock. I'm from Sydney. My first book was a retelling of Romeo and Juliet with cats called Tabby. I've been very lucky with my work. I've been picked up for distribution to a couple of places. My biggest achievement, and I really love this, is my books are basically in every library in Australia and New Zealand, and in Singapore as well, and Canada and the UK. So the last count I had, it was about 500 different libraries, and it's makes me really happy to see when people borrowing and taking my books out. Besides that, I've been working with quite a few different publishers in terms of creating some small content. And hopefully 2021 should be really interesting because I've got a lot of commission work that should be being released. Thanks so much, Queenie.
Great. Thanks for that. Darren, can you introduce yourself?
Yeah, my name's Darren. I'm from Melbourne, and my qualifications are nowhere near as impressive as all of those. I just make a silly comic book about a kangaroo called Killaroo, and I've been doing so for about 20 years. So there you go.
Okay, well, thank you. Madeline?
Well, I'm Madeline Rosker, and I actually have a history that started pretty similar to Queenie. I did an English language manga back in the early 2000-ish called Hollow Fields, and that was quite successful, and like Stephen, it ended up in quite a few libraries and whatnot, and it was an all-ages comic. It was great writing for kids, but right now I'm writing a webtoon for teenagers called Rise from Ashes. So yeah, I'm here to talk about webtoons. Yeah, and I live with a lot of people at the moment because I've got 2 kids now. Yeah.
Right. Awesome. And Sean?
Well, g'day guys. My name's Sean Keenan. I run and own the publishing company called Comics to Movies. We have one of the #1 independent selling comic books in Australia called the Extreme Champion Tournament, which earlier this year we sold our 7,000th issue, which is a pretty big achievement for a little indie title. Also co-create Terra Olympus with Stephen. I also have 2 new series coming out later this year called Talus of Sparta and Fractured Shards. And in 2021, we're going to be opening our publishing wing to other creators to help them kind of on this journey. So here to talk about that and what that involves and going about publishing a little bit differently.
Oh, fantastic. That's great to hear. So anyway, you obviously all have worked in the indie space, and that's what many of you are currently doing. Some of you have experience working in the traditional publishing model as well. So perhaps we could discuss why it is that you chose to work in indie space. Could it be to some of the difficulties you encountered in traditional publishing? So let's talk about that a little bit. Stefan, what do you think?
Oh, look, I've been lucky that I have been picked up for certain books, but in most cases, like I won't name the particular publisher, but one Australian publisher which I was very fortunate to pitch up to, and I actually pitched up to almost the what they call the, I think, the publishing editor, the guy who basically decides yes or no who comes in, and his comment to me was, "I love it. It looks great. I don't know how to market graphic novels in Australia." And I have to say, when I was told that, it basically at the time, it broke my heart. And the one thing I find is, and I know, like, say, Scholastics has this great graphics division, but in terms of, say, in Australia, none of the big publishers here in Australia have that separate arm where they kind of know what to do with it. And that publisher in question was actually, they gave really good feedback in terms of saying, oh, look, we can get traditional books through autobiographies of Shane Warne or that, or, you know, we know how to market that. We know how to sell those books. I don't know how to sell graphic novels. And this is before the whole Treehouse things became big. This is before Dogman became big. And I think now a lot of those publishers are starting to say, hey, guess what? We're starting to open the books up a lot more. Like, look at Scholastics. Their graphic novels range from next to nothing. Man, you've got so many titles. I've got a little girl in school, and when I get the Scholastics, you know, the book club magazine that comes through, there's at least 4 or 5 different graphic novels in that magazine, and I think it's fantastic. So in terms of the traditional, go back about 5 years when I started, it would have been very, very difficult. I think that's changing now. So if there's a lot of people out there who have a good pitch, good ideas, I think a lot of the traditional publishers are seeing the growth, and I think they will be taking more chances. Like Jules Faber, who's a friend of mine, even he got picked up. And I think it's that, not quite the graphic novel, but if you know the Diary of the Wimpy Kid, that type of genre where you have a lot of words, but a lot of graphics that go with it. Same with, I think, same with your book, your what would you call your one, Queenie? I can't remember. Mixed graphics. I don't know what the right word.
Comics prose, I guess. Fable
comic prose. That's it.
Yeah.
I think that's becoming very big as well.
Yeah, okay, well, thank you. I think these are some good comments, but I think I would have to clarify them a little bit, because there's a difference between American publishers and Australian publishers. I totally agree with what Stefan said. Australian publishers are still on the conservative side, but they understand that there is money to be made in this, and I guess the problem is that I think Australian publishers just don't have the deeper pockets. Not saying that American publishers have really deep pockets, but they just don't have the deep pockets that deeper pockets that American publishers do. So I think well, I agree with Stefan's comments. I think we need to make that distinction. So Madeline, you've worked with US publishers over the years. I mean, what are your comments about them, you know, and what your choices eventually came to be?
Yeah, I've switched to online and web comics. Working through the biggest web comics publisher right now, which is Webtoon, I find it a lot easier to work digitally. It's a lot faster. I do have to do more work each week, but it actually pays quite a lot better than my publisher did. My US publisher was a smaller publisher than yours, so and yours didn't pay hugely. I know Tokyo Pop didn't.
Let's be clear about that. Nobody is making bank here.
They have a Tokyo Pop, along with my publisher was 7 Seas. They have a sort of a flat rate for all their books, or they did back in the 2000s. And yeah, it's not. It seems like a lot of money when you're new to it, but when you realise it's quite a lot of work and how long it takes, it's not a lot of money. But Webtoon feels actually a lot more like having a 9-to-5 job that actually pays a decent amount each month. So it's got a huge readership. It's much bigger, and they don't have the problems of physically getting the book out to people. So I guess I've probably become a bit of a convert just because my experience has been a lot easier doing it online. The thing you miss out on is you don't have a physical book that you can promote and go to cons with. So right now, if I went to a con for Rise from Ashes, I wouldn't really have anything to sell at an artist's alley or anything, because everything's online, unless I printed out artworks for it or something like that. But yeah, apart from not having the physical book, definitely in this day and in a digital age, it definitely feels a lot easier to work this way than it did previously.
Right. Well, thanks, Madeline. Darren, do you have anything to add to that?
Well, I guess I haven't really looked too much into external publishers. I've basically self-published most of the stuff that I do. Having a graphic design background means I don't need any assistance to actually put the books together and so forth. So, yeah, so I haven't really investigated those sides of things.
Right,
And
you started very early with your self-publishing. I mean, Killaroo's been around for a long time. A lot of people in the local scene knows about it. So your experiences are obviously very different to other people's, because back in the, I guess, the 80s and the 90s, it's like people just, like publishers just, I mean, comics just wasn't even bookstores. Like, you know, it just wasn't even a thing, like even on the distant horizon. The internet has changed a lot, certainly. And I guess, you know, your experiences are fascinating too, because of your, you know, the length of time you've been doing your work and, you know, making your work known through alternative channels, if not exactly normal bookstores, mostly, you know, local comic bookstores. And back in the 80s, I think Australian indie comics got a lot more traction sheerly by virtue of it, you know, being Australian as well.
Yeah, well, unfortunately, I missed the. I started publishing proper in 2000, and prior to that, in the last 10 years, like 1990 onwards, newsagents were actually a big way for Australian comics to actually get distributed. And I kind of missed that wave. Like, I don't think you can even buy Phantom in some comic shop, in some newsagents now. It's just a completely dead market. But, you know, I've kind of done pretty well just basically self-publishing, going to Supernova conventions over the years, and slowly building up an audience, and also a network of comic shops here in Australia that will stock the book when I release one. It's not making any money at all, but you know, I feel like I've built up a reputation and a character that's fairly iconic, and it's something that I'm hoping to look into some other avenues, such as animation, and yet Kickstarter is basically something that Stephen and Sean have been very successful at, that I've only just sort of dipped my toe in the waters of, and I'm finding it's a really good way to cover those print costs that you know, we've all had to otherwise just finance ourselves, and just having that ability to raise the money and reach a different market as well. Like the Kickstarter has, I'm getting backing and customers that I've never seen before. So a lot of them are just going through Kickstarter looking for new comic projects. So that's kind of cool.
Yeah, great. We're going to be talking.
Probably can elaborate on that.
We're going to be talking about Kickstarter in a moment, but before that, I'm going to ask Sean whether you have any exciting stories to share about any attempts to get at traditional publishing.
No, so I did things completely different from my side. I was totally naive in the indie scene, and I actually did the very first Australian Kickstarter in 2015. So when Kickstarter came to Australia, I ran the first comic Kickstarter and thought, oh, you know, how good is this? How easy is this? And learnt very quickly that you know, that is not the case. And then fell into all of those troubles that we fall into afterwards, which is distribution, how we go about selling items other than ourselves. So, you know, how do we get it into stores? You know, the cost of everything. So the cost behind the printing, the storing of all that stuff, all these other issues that, you know, I just was totally naive about. So it was a very steep learning curve. So I've been self-publishing since 2015, but it's been something that I've really enjoyed and really loved. And I know we'll talk about Kickstarter soon, but that's been the main medium that I've used. I had tried to pitch my first series XCT to a couple of places, but I think the hardest part that I had was that I didn't have any other published body of work, whether that be self-published or anything else, and I think that was quite difficult in regards to even getting my foot in the door, because it was kind of like, well, you know, who are you, what have you done, you know, and that type of stuff. So, yeah, I've now kind of learnt bits and pieces along the way and trying to pull that all in together. And with comics to movies, I just thought that there was a gap in the marketplace, which is kind of being filled by a few of the bigger publishers now, but a really good opportunity to help people get published and get their stuff out and kind of fast track their learning through what I've already done.
Right. Well, thank you very much for that, Sean. As we said before, we're going to talk about Kickstarter soon, but I would like to frame it in a larger way. For example, we all kind of mentioned Kickstarter, and Madeline, you mentioned Webtoons. I think for our next question, we could talk about some of the alternate ways that people who do comics can use to raise money outside the traditional publishing system. So we've had Kickstarter mentioned, and Madeline, you talked about Webtoons being a reliable source of money for you. I could also mention Patreon. If anyone's got a Patreon, it's a good time to mention that in the next question. And there's also academia. You know, I mentioned earlier that I was doing a PhD. I got a scholarship for doing that in the next 3 years. And my master's, I also got a scholarship for my master's at Macquarie University, and that also funded a comic, one of my Women Who Were Kings comics about Wu Zetian, the female Chinese emperor. So that is also a possible revenue avenue in which people can actually, you know, create a comic and kind of get paid to do so, even though you obviously have to write the dissertation. So there's also government grants. If anyone has the opportunity to get a grant, whether it's from the government or a company, great time to mention it. So Stefan, so we'll start with you. Can you talk about a little bit of your Kickstarter and grants experience, etc.?
Oh, I'll start with the grants part of it, because I'm sure Darren and Sean will give a lot of good Kickstarter wealth. So I've actually been very fortunate with grants. I think so far I've got grants from the ACT government, I've got grants from the New South Wales government, and I think I've received 2 grants from, actually 3 grants now from the Australian federal government as a whole. I would like to say that, look, if you apply for a grant, it is, I don't know, I've got 5 and I've been really lucky, but there's actually quite a lot of work involved in it. Sorry.
Could you talk a little bit about what that is?
Yep. So what my advice is for people listening to the panel, listening to this panel who want to apply, is basically build your references up. You need to be shown to be somebody who's credible. So for example, some of the stuff I did was I wrote to my local member of parliament and I basically explained myself to them. I got a reference letter from my local member of parliament. I got a reference letter from a key librarian. You know her, Karen Duarte. She was very, very vocal about me, and she was very, very helpful. And she said, "Look, this is a good guy. He's done works before. If you sponsored his future works, it is going to happen." Because most of the grants, your own creative endeavor, they don't try to judge you too much on your creative endeavor. So they try to judge you on whether you can deliver what you say you're going to deliver. And more importantly, they also judge you on how much you're going to help the Australian arts community as a whole. So for a good example, the last grant I got was from Create New South Wales. That grant was actually to work with a New South Wales colorist. His name was Chris Pitcairn. He's a really, really good guy. He does absolutely fantastic work. And it just so happened that Chris, because of 2020, and it's been a really horrible year for most people, but because of that, he actually had a gap in his schedule. He had a 1-2 month gap in his schedule. So for me, it was like, man, I get to work with this one guy who I've wanted to work with for ages. But to be fair, I need to pay him. I can't just, work and expect it for free. So I got the grant, and putting it together to say, look, he has free time, I have free time, we can both link up. At the end of it, you will see a completed graphic novel as my final deliverable. It then puts it forward to the grant office to go, hey, guess what? These guys are serious. They are, and they have a body of evidence. Like, they are real creators. They have books. They have ISBNs. They've been around the system a bit. We're going to give these guys a shot. I think that's what the grants people look for the most. It makes it very difficult, though, if you're a first-time creator, unfortunately. And that's where, if you're a first-time creator looking for a grant, I say put some skin in the game. Take a risk on your own first, because once you have that one body of evidence, that one book, that one thing that you can show, I've actually done it, you can then use that as your grant. Because one whole section of the grants is references and basically showing your previous work. If you can fill that section in really tightly, I think you have a really good shot with grants.
All right. Well, thank you very much.
So I'll pass back to you.
Please continue.
I was going to say the one thing that I've noticed that grants have changed, and you hit the nail on the head there, Stephen, was that skin in the game. A lot of the grants now won't actually just go off your application. You actually need to supply a certain amount of finished artwork, as well as the script. So I actually find it quite interesting that they've actually started to change their process as well to weed out those people in regards to, well, you know, we need to see you put some skin in the game first before we're going to give you any money back. So that's something that I just noticed on the last grant application that I went for. I never had, even though I did do it beforehand, it was something that now was a requirement that wasn't before.
Oh, definitely. And the funniest grant we ever had, and this is a grant I actually won together with Sean because we had a collaborative effort, was actually a popularity grant. So there was the ACT grant that was put forward was basically it allowed the public to vote, and the top 5 projects which were voted on got the grant. So that's actually one of the funnier ones, because me and Sean were just hustling. Please vote for me. Please vote for me. Please vote for me. We came in 4th, which is all that mattered, because if
that's fantastic. Great.
4, we're in. But yeah, so that was a funnier grant. But look, most traditional grants, exactly like Sean said, put some skin in the game, get something ready to show, and get your references ready.
Right. Well, that was very valuable information. I don't know anything about government grants, so I was quite surprised. It seems that the rate of completion for grants tends to be quite low, and this is why they're initiating these kinds of hurdles. Well, they're not hurdles, but for people, in that they very often get. I guess in the past they've handed out grants to people who just didn't finish their work, and that was a big concern for them because it's just money evaporating, I guess, for them. Yep. So thank you very much. That was very valuable information. Darren, can you talk a little bit about your Kickstarter experiences?
Well, as I said, Sean and Stephen are really the veterans of it. I'm just a newcomer. I launched one, what was it? September. It was basically a book that myself and Stuart Black had basically completed. We'd been working on it over the last year or so, and I had ideas of basically funding the printing of it through Kickstarter as a trial run. I'd wanted to use Kickstarter for some other projects, but down the line. But I thought, well, we'll give this as a test and see how it goes. So as a result of that, we had an awful lot to show for the project, and that's one of the key points of Kickstarter that I found is you need to show this book is going to happen, and a lot of progress images from that, like preview pages and so forth, gives customers I guess a bit of a reassurance that yes, this book will get done if I fund it, because I think there's been a few notorious Kickstarters in Australian comics beforehand that have raised an awful lot of money and then nothing. And we all know what I'm talking
grants.
But yeah, very similar to grants, you know, where people have put their money on the line and said, this looks great, and they didn't get anything to show for it. So I think probably having had a track record of publishing Killaroo comics, I think probably helped again with that side of things, because
an established audience, and that
they were fairly sure I was going to deliver because I have so many
without the Kickstarter. So
yes, that's right. So and I learned a lot of lessons through that Kickstarter. It basically took off to a point that I wasn't ready for. And yeah, it ended up raising just shy of $17,000, which is nuts. But one of the pitfalls with Kickstarters, which the other two I mentioned know all about, is you can't give away too many extras in order to reach your goal, because they really cut into the amount of money that you'll actually get towards the end. You know, I had enamel pins, I had prints, stickers, fridge magnets. Like, the comic ended up being the minor part of what people received in the mail when it was done. And, you know, I'm not complaining. Like, it was a very successful campaign, but you learn a lot along the way. And Stephen and Sean both helped me a lot to set up the campaign, and a lot of invaluable advice that basically enabled that to succeed. So, yeah, I guess, and I just recently launched another one, which is a shorter book, and I'm realizing that just because your first one goes gangbusters doesn't mean the next one will either. So
I'm sure Sean will have,
I think there's a lot of luck and timing that go into, you know, sometimes you just pick the exact cherry ripe spot of when to launch a campaign, but also you need to put in an awful lot of work setting it up before you launch.
Yeah.
And that's probably one of the main things. I think some people just upload a picture and they say, well, this is what I'm going to do, and send me money, and it just doesn't work that way.
Yeah. Well, thanks very much for that, Darren. I think that we can move on to Sean next. So, Sean, can you talk about your Kickstarter experiences?
Yeah, so I've ran 14 Kickstarters to date.
Veteran.
Which is crazy. I got one active at the moment, and I have had one failed Kickstarter. So I think, you know, what I will say about Kickstarter is you never ever stop learning. And I think that with anything in life is you are always learning new things, you're always evolving, and the platform is always evolving as well. So I did mention before that I did run one all the way back in 2015 when Kickstarter was first available in Australia, and I use it predominantly for raising the printing costs of my book. So I pay all the artists, writers, everything like that up to the point that it's almost completed, and then use Kickstarter to raise those funds. Again, as Darren said, the more you've got prepared and the more you've got done prior to launch gives that sense of, you know, that you can fulfill what you're saying you're going to fulfill. And I think, you know, that's the biggest hurdle that you get from people, is if they don't know who you are, one, you need to try to connect to them. So, you know, I know Stephen doesn't like this, but doing a lot of videos and putting yourself out there is really the only way, especially in this digital media, to be able to come across and sell yourself. Because, you know, people support a project, but they also support you as a person. So, you know, doing little things like live launches. So the last 2 launches that I've done for Kickstarters have been the best starts to any of my campaigns, and that's because I've done a live launch. I really feel that really helped me get off to a good start. The other thing, the technical side of things, is there's a lot of algorithms and all that behind Kickstarter and how projects are shown and everything like that. So getting a really good understanding of the platform, having a look at successful campaigns, you know, not copying but modeling your Kickstarter page off other pages is a really good idea. Looking at other people's pledges, so to get an idea of what the rewards are. And then where a lot of creators fail, and Darren touched on this before, is understanding all your costs. So how much it costs to ship, how much it costs to print. If you're going to do stretch rewards, how much they cost to produce, how much that increases shipping and all of those type of things. So there's a lot of tools out there. There's you know, Kickstarter budget tools that you can use to help you with that process. But it is a really good platform to build an audience. You know, I wasn't Darren. I didn't have much of an audience when I first did my Kickstarter. So my second one raised considerably less than my first one, because it was a lot of family and friends that were, you know, will back you the first time, and then the second time you're like, oh, where is everyone? And that's because it's not necessarily people that you know, that they want to support you as a person, not support your work. So it is about building that audience, and that takes time. And you know, once you have a little bit of success, you can fall into the trap of trying to do things too quickly. And it is about, you know, timing, giving yourself space, giving yourself room, giving your audience room, and then trying to cross promote and get people to come that you've never touched before or met before as well. So.
All right. Well, thank you so much for that. What I'm getting from the grants and the Kickstarter thing right now is that you really need to come prepared. And people do seem to look at your track record when you're doing your thing. So I'm guessing even if you have a really, really astoundingly great application or an amazing Kickstarter page and an amazing video and sample art, people do look at your track record and see whether you've done previous work that has finished and that has a certain level of quality. So Madeline, you work in Webtoons. Would you say the same applies there, or are the rules completely different?
The thing about Webtoon is it's almost a little bit like applying for a job, because they have two different levels, and the first level is probably a bit closer to what you're talking about, like crowdfunding, because they pay you through Patreon on the first level, and that's so it's pretty much a bit more dependent on you promoting yourself and using your Patreon proactively. I'll admit, since I don't need it anymore, I'm a little bit guilty of abandoning mine a little bit more, but I've got to get it going again, because it's always a good source of income. But when they realise that you're getting a certain amount of readers, and it's usually over about 2,000 a week or so, they invite you to pitch to them. And if you give a successful pitch for your comic, and mine was successful, then they take you on as a hosted webcomic officially. It means you can't host your webcomic anywhere else, but it also means essentially you sort of become a member of their staff, and you're paid per month for each update. And it's quite a lot more generous than, well, I suppose unless you were really, really, really popular on Patreon. Yeah, it's definitely been a step up. And they also take over the promotion of it. If you're kind of used to promoting your own stuff, which maybe Darren is a bit more, you might not always like how they do it because they make the decisions for you. But for me, I'm kind of a typical artist where I'm a bit hopeless at self-promotion. It's actually been really nice having someone take over a bit. So yeah, it's a bit more like having a job as such. Mine's going to end soon because I'm wrapping my comic up. I kind of feel like it's a good time to wrap it up because I've got 2 little kids, and I've kind of sort of run into that wall where you've got to get your kids over a certain age before you can do comics again properly. So I haven't been able to take my comic as long as I would have liked to, but yeah, I'm hoping to pitch something again once I've got my home life a bit more in order and the kids are at a more independent age and whatnot, and I can spend more time on it. But yeah, it's a bit more like having a job rather than a Kickstarter or a Patreon where you do have to do a lot of the work from the ground up, which some people really like, but I'm disorganized, so this has suited me quite well.
as are a lot of artists. Before I carry on, I need to clarify things a little bit. Webtoons is a Korean company. So from what you're telling me, Madeline, the way that they do things is actually very different from traditional Western webcomic model. I don't think anyone here was particularly involved in that, but it's drastically different because webcomics used to be a thing on the internet where you just promote your own thing. And there were aggregate sites where people can post large number of webcomics, but generally it is just you do your own.
And I actually started off on those sites with this title and kind of built up some of my readership from there. And yeah, a lot of those sites come with their own built-in forums, and you can kind of put your stuff out there and whatnot. Tapastic was one of the ones I was also on. I pitched to Hiveworks, which is the big US conglomerate of webcomics, and they actually turned it down. So so I was quite lucky to have my pitch to the Nova Webtoon, the Korean group, was successful. It's kind of...
When was that, can I ask?
When? It would have been January 2017.
Right.
And yeah, their parent company is Korean, but essentially it's the US branch of them, and they copy the Korean model, but they run everything from America with all American editors, and they tend to look for slightly more Western tastes and things. Although there's a huge female readership, and romance comics are probably the most successful thing on there right now.
I was about to mention that. Webtoons itself is a very different kind of model to traditional webcomics. They do have millions and millions and millions of readers, and the top comics are extremely successful. But if anyone's looking to get into Webtoons, it's best to do a little bit of research, because the audience tends to be younger, and they tend to be female, so they do have certain preferences. Not saying that you can't be successful with a completely different kind of genre, but it is good to know these things, and thank you so much to Madeline for talking a little bit more about her experiences working with Webtoons at a higher level. Because I think most people, when they enter Webtoons, just as an entry-level Webtooner, they don't get access to the same things that Madeline has. So again...
there's two levels, Yeah,
so again... I guess you do need to have some preparation beforehand, in that they do expect a certain level of readership from from the creator before you're allowed to, become official, so to speak.
Well, and they don't automatically make you official. They invite you to pitch, so they could still turn you down even if you. But I think it's also worth noting that they're very, very fond of money. So
really,
even if you've got an unusual title that doesn't fit any of their genres or anything, the amount of readers you'll have really speaks to them. And if you've got loads of readers, they probably will give you a position.
Yeah, so good to know. But I guess that's thank you for that. Anyway, so my next question would be, probably before I go on, webcomics is and Webtoons is a very fast-moving space. So hopefully in the future we can, Madeline, you can continue talking a bit more about your continued experiences with Webtoons. And awesome. So the next question is, now that you've all kind of established where you stand and what your choice of drug is. So Stefan, you do grants, Madeline, Webtoons, Darren, Sean, you both do Kickstarter, and Stefan too. What are the advantages and disadvantages of your chosen methods? You've all talked about how you've learned a lot during that time. Is there anything that you kind of felt that you could have done better, or anything that you feel that is just really sucks and you just have to deal with it? So Stefan, start with you.
Okay, look, with Kickstarter, and I'll run back to, because grants are a little bit of luck as well. Like I remember with the last grant I applied for, the Create New South Wales grant, I actually had a phone call back from the New South Wales office basically saying, hey, look, we would love to give it to you, but we only can give out 10 grants this session. I strongly advise you reapply for the next session. I got that one phone call. So sometimes it's just, hey, look, we want to give it to you, it's just not this time. So I reapplied for the next session, and I got the call back after that saying, hey, we were happy to give it to you this time.
Oh, you were just number 11.
Yeah, I was probably number 11. So I was really happy to be number 11, because they encourage me a lot to do so. But with Kickstarter, the one thing I've actually loved more than it's become a little bit more like a pre-order system for me. In terms of the one thing I love for me, Kickstarter, if I always get asked the question, do you prefer more backers or do you prefer more money funded? And my answer is always more backers. There's one good example, one really good Australian creator, Ryan Lindsay. Man, his Kickstarters get the 400 backers, 500 backers. I think in the top 10 Australian most backed Kickstarters, I think Ryan Lindsay holds like 4 positions of those. In the top 10, he owns 4 of those. Me and Sean have one comic in the top 10, but Ryan Lindsay holds about 4 of them. And I think that's very important because it shows your readership growing. And I think it's like you mentioned, I think it was mentioned a few times, a lot of us here, we're not doing this for the money. We're absolutely not. We're doing this because we are creatives. We want a story to be read. And if we can get paid along the way, that's fantastic. But for me, it's building that readership. And like, for example, my last graphic novel that I sent a reader copy out to somebody, and he came back and said, this is the best thing I've ever read. And it's one of those comments which, you know, it makes it all worthwhile. Or it makes out the comments you get back of, when's the next one coming out? I can't wait. And those type of things makes it all worthwhile. And saying the Kickstarter space is that growth. Like Sean said, the initial bit of Kickstarter were family and friends, which is fine because that's the people who want to support you through. But I think with me, I've been lucky to move past the family and friends and getting people who actually want the next part of the story. And seeing that growth, I think Kickstarter is a really good platform to build that growth through. My backer count went from, you know, less than 100 to now over 300 for most campaigns. And to even contemplate it, to think 300 people are supporting you. Thank you so much to, you know, all 300 of you, because it makes it worthwhile. And like with Madeline, imagine, like you were saying, 2,000 plus people are reading your work every week. That's incredible, you know, and I'll be honest with you, that's why we do it. And Kickstarter giving you that platform for people to give you the money for you to continue. Yeah, it's my definitely funding model of choice.
Okay, well, fantastic. Thanks, Stefan. So, Sean, as Stefan's collaborator, I'm sure, and a long-time Kickstarter guru, what do you have to add to that? What are the advantages and disadvantages of Kickstarter?
Well, I'm going to say the biggest advantage I find is if you have a really good collaborator.
Thank you.
Stephen, and I think Darren can speak to this as well, when you have someone else that's just as invested in a project, you're able to bring 2 audiences together rather than just trying to focus on your one audience. So I find whenever I work with Stephen and with my latest one with Talos of Sparta, I was able to generate a lot more interest a lot earlier because we're bringing 2 audiences to a Kickstarter. So if people are out there and they're a writer and they you know can't pay an artist and they want to collaborate, it is a really good way you know, to move into something, to do something 50-50 where you're sharing all the cost, you're sharing all the burden, but you're both then both invested just as much. So that's the one really big advantage, I'd say. The disadvantage is, you know, a lot of us will have full-time jobs on top of you know, our creative endeavors, and Kickstarter is a full-time job. You know, for that 30 days, it's, you know, posting on social media, it's organizing podcasts, it's, you know, going live, it's creating different media so you're not showing the same picture all the time. It's about swapping out stretch goals. It's about, you know, checking it every 5 seconds when you're hitting the refresh button and the back drives you crazy. So it is a lot of work, but I do feel that the reward at the end of it, I always say to Stephen, like the day before and the day of the launch, I always get really, really nervous, even after doing so many, because I'm like, is this the one that they're not going to like? Is this the one that they're not going to come out and back? Is this the one where I'm like, okay, I've tried to reach too far, and I'm going to be brought back down to reality really quick. But I'm really lucky to say that I've got a really good core group of fans, a great group of network and other creators that are supportive, and then great collaborators like Stephen as well.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Sean. Darren, anything to add to that? I know you're kind of new to Kickstarter, but what do you think are the best and worst things about it?
There's not much I can add to that. I'd probably just prefer to talk maybe a little more about just traditional distribution to comic shops in Australia, which is, and it's similar in some ways in that you're building relationships with stores and store owners and trying to continue to have new product to offer on a regular basis, because most customers at comic shops, they're used to their new book coming out every month or every week, or the American comics that they normally buy, and you're really trying to compete to some degree with that shelf space. And stuff like shipping books, does this retailer cover some of that shipping, or do you cover it? And depending on, and just actually getting stores to stock your book, I might have been doing it for 20 years, but there's still a lot of resistance from a lot of Australian comic shops that, this is a risk, I don't want to be left with dead stock. So it's tricky to try and convince stores to take it on. And I guess in some instances, such as D's Comics, Brendan at that store actually actively sells and promotes Killaroo books to all his customers. And as a result, like the sales figures of Killaroo in that shop, like everything else pales in comparison. I've got quite a few great retailers that do stock the book, but it's usually maybe 10, 20 copies over the life of a particular issue. And D's regularly sells 50 to 100 copies of the store. So
yep. I guess we should also talk about needing to give a cut of the cover price to the store as well, which can be surprisingly high to people who don't know how comic book stores work.
That's definitely a factor, because you've got to make it worth their while for stocking the book. So whenever I'm calculating the printing cost and the retail cost, a big 50%, part of
usually 40 to 50% of the cover price.
Yeah, so you really have to budget that into what your expected sales are, what your shipping will be, and I think that's probably somewhere where Kickstarter has actually been very helpful, because by funding the entire print line of the book, I'm not just covering the printing for the backers, but I also generally reinvest any profits into additional copies of the book that I can sell at conventions or retailers. So having a unit cost come down to zero really makes a big difference in being able to offer the book to stores at a price that I'll still make a return on, and that they'll be encouraged to continue selling the book because they're making often a better cut than they do from a Marvel or a DC book.
Right. Well, fantastic, Darren. Thanks so much for that. So, Madeline, good and bad of webtoons.
The good and bad of webtoons. I think I might have already covered it, or I think the only really bad thing is not having a physical product, because I really like the feeling of being able to hold a book. And it's also a very particular audience, even though there's a lot of them. The thing I liked about my print comic, Hollow Fields, and I think Stephen mentioned this briefly, was people who come across it in unusual places, especially kids, because it's an all ages one. You just get these kids who've seen it in their library or at a book fair, and they send you messages, or they say, oh, I got an email from a kid in Perth just a few months ago that was like, oh, it's a careers assignment at school, and it's like, what do you want to be as an adult? And I decided to write to you because we've got your book in our library. And it's just really kind of sweet little interactions like that kind of don't necessarily happen as much with the 15 to 25-year-old webtoon crowd that are a bit more of a set crowd.
Yeah, absolutely.
So I kind of miss interacting with the younger crowd, but yeah, webtoons is not for the younger kids.
Yeah, I guess there are also disadvantages to dealing with free webcomics, in that audiences do have expectations sometimes, and
yeah,
bit nasty on the creator when you don't update as quickly as they think you should.
Well, also every single one of your updates each week has a forum below it with posts, and yeah, sometimes things that get upvoted and things that you see, you just roll your eyes and think, oh, you know.
YouTube comments.
Yeah, it is. It's a bit like YouTube comments, or if you make one little mistake in your artwork, just expect that to be the top comment and have about 200 comments under it. It's just so, you know.
Do you are you allowed to fix your art if something like that happens? Because I understand community feedback.
You can fix it, but the comment's going to stay there, so... I don't think I've ever done anything that bad, or yeah, I don't think I've ever made any mistake. There's been people who've left out whole panels and or uploaded the wrong chapter or whatnot. But yeah.
Wow. Yeah. Also, since you essentially work for webtoons in a kind of structured environment, are there any penalties for not uploading your comic at a particular time? Like, I think they do have deadlines or stuff like that.
Yeah. It's deadline every week. And obviously if you don't upload it, there's no update that week. And apart from the annoyance of having everybody fill the previous chapter with comments about where's the new chapter, you also don't get paid that month for the 4 chapters each month. You get only paid for 3 chapters and whatnot. And if it happens more than a couple of times, you're probably going to start getting emails from higher up and editors asking if you can really commit to this schedule or what's going on and whatnot. I've managed it so far, but yeah, sometimes it is a bit of a stress.
Yeah, so it does have the usual pressures of serialized fiction, or that people have expectations of you, but then you are getting paid a set amount, so they do kind of expect you to stick to a schedule.
Yeah, I'd also say one of the other irritations is they often go by panel count. So they say they want 30 to 40 panels every week from me for my particular comic. And sometimes you do like a really long panel that has several story elements in it and various characters interacting. You try to make it quite artsy and whatnot, and the editor will just count it as one panel, even though about a panel's worth of stuff has just happened. It's so frustrating.
Wow. Yeah. Well, thanks for that. Sorry.
Yeah, on the flip side, if you do like one little space of white as a spacer or something, that also counts as a panel. So that's like a tactic that you can think of.
Yeah, a lot of people do that on webtoons, I bet.
A couple of those have shown up, yeah, especially recently.
Yeah, meet a deadline. Yeah, okay, well, thank you so much for that, Madeline. That was quite fascinating. We have about 10 minutes left, so I would try and squeeze 2 questions in as quick as possible. So name one mistake that you made in your journey that you would like to have corrected and would have done differently. Okay, Stefan, starting with you.
Oh, look, I do look back at some of the stuff I originally wrote when I first started, and I cringe. I think like most people here, if you look back at what started, but I would say, look, don't be afraid to make mistakes. Like, that's the best. The stuff I write now is, I have to say, it's a lot better than the stuff I wrote last year. And the stuff I'm going to write next year is going to be better than the stuff I wrote this year. So if you don't allow yourself to make mistakes, you're never going to learn. You're never going to get better at it. So if any first-time creators are listening to this, make all the mistakes, because guess what? You'll learn not to do it next time, and you'll be much better for it.
Okay, thanks. Darren, name one mistake that you made in the past that you wish you could fixed.
The one that stands out, I think, the first couple of comics that I did, I invited a lot of people to collaborate on Killaroo, and that included basically writing and drawing however they wanted to. So as a result, the first two books of Killaroo, which are thankfully out of print, basically were complete. There's no central character. Like it could be 15 different Killaroo stories of 15 different characters that just happen to look similar. So I guess when you're collaborating, you've got to still take hold of the reins and not let your IP or your idea or character of your IP to be, I guess, deviated from too far. Like part of the collaborative process is allowing a little bit of control, but you can't let them affect the central theme of the character. Otherwise, there's just no continuity between stories. They don't believe that this is the same character that they read about before. So, yeah, I guess in collaboration, just still keep a firm hold of the reins, so that if you're dealing with one particular IP, that it remains true to, I guess, your vision of the character.
Right. So well-meaning, but herding cartoonists is like herding cats.
Yes.
It's a tough challenge, particularly when you're starting out. So, Sean, one mistake that you've made.
I'll do mine really quickly. Invest in contracts. You know, it's a sad old story that you go the cheap option. You try and grab one from a free online site. Something happens and you get caught out. So I would implore everyone to invest in a contract. Especially if they've got their own IP and they're paying people. So learn from those mistakes.
Yeah, very important. Contracts, friendships and working relationships have been lost over this sort of stuff. So don't cheap out on it. Always, read the fine print, so to speak. So Madeline, one mistake you've made.
I'd probably agree with that, actually. I'd say reading the fine print. In terms of my print comics, although this was a rookie mistake because it was many years ago now, but yeah, you sort of, when it's your first publication, I think you get very excited and you just want to get in no matter what, and you sign it. And then when push comes to shove and you're trying to get the rights to it back, it's the publisher just says, no, we've got it and you signed it and there's nothing you can do. And you just think, yeah, they're right. And I was dumb. So there's nothing you can do.
Yeah. So go.
I would love the rights to Hollowfields back, but even though a new one hasn't been reprinted in a while, they're just digging their heels in and they won't give it back. So that's the end of that.
That's a story I could back up as well.
Yeah, I know. Yeah. Yeah. It hurts.
Anyway, to clarify comments about contracts, not just contracts between collaborators, but very shady contracts from big publishers are very common these days. A lot of big companies have a lot of contracts and a lot of shady terms, and they're usually unwilling to negotiate. So given what we've talked about today, if you're considering taking a shady contract from a publisher, look at everyone else in this panel. They're doing quite well without them. So something to consider.
I would also say you can contact the Australian Society of Authors and they can get you in contact with a lawyer who can read over a contract for you.
Absolutely. There's a lot of organisations that have pro bono lawyers that are willing to help you, but it is important to remember that law differs from the US and from Australia. So if you have an Australian lawyer, they probably can't help you with a US contract. Just something to consider in mind. Okay, so thank you very much. We're in the closing stretch of our panel. It's been an hour already. I can't believe it. Anyway, before we close, I would ask one final question. Just what advice would you give people starting out today to do what you're doing? Yeah, so just one piece of advice. Stefan.
Oh, look, just do it really. And it's look, I procrastinate, and I think many of you have the story for, I procrastinated for the longest time. I've wanted to do this back in the early 2000s, and I didn't start until 2015. And one of the biggest things for me to start was actually I had a little girl, and I never wanted to say to my little girl, hey, guess what? Daddy always wanted to do this, but he didn't. So my thing would be, look, do it, fail along the way, make mistakes along the way, reach out to people along the way. It's all okay, but it's not okay to look back 10 years later and go, hey, guess what? I never got round to it. And there's so many avenues which have been discussed in this panel and so many other avenues that are available. Take the chance, take the time, and create, really.
Yeah. Okay, fantastic. Sean?
For me, I've got a really great saying that I love, and that's get comfortable with being uncomfortable. Put yourself outside of your comfort zone. Do things that you would not normally do. That's where growth happens. That's where creative magic happens. So that's mine.
Yeah, a lot of people are very awkward with the self-promotion thing. I guess with indie publishing is that you have to do it no matter how uncomfortable it makes you. So Madeline?
Yeah, I guess it's something similar. Don't try to be a perfectionist because you'll end up with a blank sheet of paper. That's about it.
Yeah. And you have editors on your back if you don't get that those 30 panels in. And so, yep, you will just have to let it go. It's if it's going to be a job. So Darren?
I would say seek constructive criticism from fellow creators on your work, because I see quite a few artists and creators, and their main source of feedback is from their mum, and mum is always going to love what you do, so you're not going to get proper constructive criticism from friends and family. Some friends you might, but you just seek, I guess, advice and suggestions from people who are already making comics, whether that's people in the US or locally, just and be prepared to take on that advice and not, I guess you got to grow a thick skin, and it's the only way you're going to improve as an artist is to actually get proper feedback on what you're doing right and what you're doing wrong, and then you can grow. But if you just keep getting feedback from people that just, you know, love you and what you do, you're not going to get the kind of feedback you need to push forward to the next level. So that would be my advice.
Right. Well, fantastic. Thank you so much to everyone here for participating. We're well over an hour, to be honest. We're just 10 minutes over. But anyway, I think we got a lot from this panel. So thank you so much to Stefan, Darren, Madeline, and Sean for coming today and having been part of this panel.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks, guys.
Cheers.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you. Fantastic.